Are talent attraction and retention or improving employee engagement on your radar? If so, building a healthy culture is a critical first step for unlocking potential and driving long-term success. Tier 1 Performance offers several free resources to prime your thinking, assess your culture, and help you get started. If you want to maximize culture to support high-performing teams and thriving organizations, connect with Tier 1 at tier1performance.com/culture.
Welcome to the Accidental Trainer, a podcast where you'll hear firsthand stories and tips on how to start and grow your training career.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of ATD Accidental Trainer podcast. I'm your host, Alexandria Clapp, and today we have with us Elaine Lin Hering. Elaine is a facilitator, communications coach, and author of the newly released Unlearning Silence. Hi, Elaine.
Hi, Alexandria. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Congratulations on your new book. I am so excited to chat with you about themes from your book today. But first, I want to focus on you. And I know that you are a facilitator, so I'm excited to hear a little bit about how you landed in your current role and what was accidental in your journey.
I love the name of your podcast because I feel like you've finally given me a storyline for my life. So I would very much identify as an accidental trainer. I didn't know that training was a thing. I didn't know that talent development was a thing. As I was growing up, the options were lawyer, doctor, engineer. I wasn't good at math and science. And so I took the law route. That's a, short version of it, but ended up going to Harvard Law School thinking that law was a language that could change the world, got a good taste of what day-to-day legal practice looks like and thought, maybe not for me, but simultaneously found negotiation, pedagogy, and frameworks and accidentally fell into this world of leadership development. So I spent more than a decade teaching concepts out of the Harvard Negotiation Project, skills for negotiation, difficult conversations, feedback, and so found myself an accidental trainer.
And especially the focus on, you're talking about negotiation. Last year, we did an episode with Bryant Galindo, and he does conflict resolution. It was a really popular episode, which of course is not surprising because communication ultimately ends up being a top needed skill, a skill that we need to help develop in organizations and for individuals and teams, and stuff that people are always working on themselves personally. So very cool that you have a lot of background, and really your book sort of covers this. So I want to tee up our conversation with two different stories I hear a lot from our community. The first one is a lot from instructional designers, but it sort of goes like this. You get asked to create a very specific training, and even though you might be saying to yourself, wait, this might not be the right solution, or have we done the proper needs analysis, or even I have a different idea of what would be more effective, you do the training anyways. You don't speak up for whatever reason. Inevitably, maybe the training was not as effective as it could have been, or it didn't have the impact that the stakeholder was expecting or looking for. That's something that I hear a lot. Another one that I want to mention, like a common challenge I hear from trainers, is how do I get people to speak up? No one is sharing in this training, or this topic is really hard, so no one feels comfortable talking about this. Those, I know, there are two perspectives here that I think that you have a lot of insight on to help us think about our own individual voices and creating the right conditions for others to speak up. And I was mentioning to you, as going through your book, you sort of toggle between these seamlessly throughout the book. You share your own personal stories, and you give all sorts of vignettes and stories throughout of all sorts of different people and perspectives. So I wanted to keep those two lenses in mind of our community as we start with part one of your book, which focuses on cultivating awareness. I want to start with kind of where you start, like, what's the problem with silence?
I'm going to go back, if you'll indulge me, to this pain point that you described because it's so real. right? The stakeholder says, this is what we want, give it to us in this way. And your internal voice is thinking, that's not going to work. And what stops us in the moment from saying, hold on, what's the problem we're solving for here? Or what problem are you trying to solve for? This is literally the conversation I had with someone yesterday, because there's a power dynamic, there's a perception dynamic of how you are perceived by the executive or the stakeholders, whether you are really treated as a thought partner or whether you're seen as a vendor if you're on the outside, or as quote unquote, just a trainer on the inside. But for me, and this is classic negotiation, if we anchor back to the fundamental interests of what the person making the request is trying to solve for, that allows us to actually bring forth our expertise, which is to say, I could do that, right? If we were making widgets here, I could do what you're asking me to do an effective communication in the workplace workshop. That's an option. If what you're really trying to solve for is X, here's another option that would actually solve for the problem better. So want to just inject that stakeholder management piece there, because it also gives us so many insights as to the dynamics, right? There is a power differential. There is a perception differential. There are often biases depending on who you are, where you come from, what the relationship is like. But if we anchor to what are we solving for here, it gives us something to stand on rather than just saying, okay, right? And it's not that I'm pushing back. We could do the thing that you're asking me to do. But if it's not going to solve the problem, that's actually a place where I can leverage and offer my expertise in a really helpful way.
Okay, I know I just asked you about the problem with silence, but another question I had for you is there a most common reason why we don't always use our voice? Knowing that that's sort of loaded and it depends. I'm sure that power dynamics is a big one. You just talked about that, or cultural differences or communication styles or lack of psychological safety, or there's like a million things. Now it makes me want to jump to that topic.
I love that. And actually, this is the beauty of your facilitation in this conversation, Alexandria, because the answer takes us back to silence. To me, the most common reason we don't use our voice in the moment is learned silence. So silence is editing ourselves before we even say the things out loud, because we've told ourselves it's not going to be well received. And that is based on real life experience from the past. Silence is when there's not enough room, space in the room or in the conversation for our input. It's when we haven't been invited to offer our thoughts, perspectives, interests, expertise, and we didn't think that we could. It is also when everybody else's needs, priorities, preferences have sucked up all the energy in the room. And so I guess I'm just supposed to say yes, right? If I want to keep my job, if I want the contract to renew, silence becomes the path of least resistance. To me, all of that is learned behavior, often grounded in real life experience. So I don't want to discount it. What it means is that we forget we could choose a different way at all, because that learned silence is so habitual. This is just the way things work around here. We as trainers are just second-class citizens is the message we might have internalized. And of course, the way that some of these stakeholders treat us perpetuates that learned silence. And in fact, they continue to silence us in the ways that they contribute to the conversation and interact with us. So to me, it's about learned silence, which is why I start in the book of, do we even know that there's a name for this thing? Right? Organizational psychologists have called it employee silence and organizational silence, the collective phenomenon of saying nothing because you don't think it's worth it. And if you're new to a system, you're not really going to stick your neck out and test the waters to see what happens. You look around to see, what are the norms around here? Do you actually talk or push back when Jeremy says do something? Oh, I guess not. Then we perpetuate the norm, which is often a culture of silence. The first step is there's this thing called silence. It's not you. It's not because you're deeply flawed or incapable or lack confidence or courage or need assertiveness training or any of these things. There's this thing called silence that we swim in, that we have learned, that is often invisible to us. So step number one is being able to see it. Step number two is wrestle with it of how well are these patterns serving me, my work, how I want to show up in the world, and then we can take it from there.
Oh man, I knew this was going to happen. It makes me think of all sorts of new questions that I didn't have planned, and I'm already going off book.
That is the beauty of conversation and facilitation. Let's do it.
Yes. Okay. As you were describing this challenge and silence, I was thinking about our community. They're so passionate about taking care of their people, the participants, their learners, and being their advocates and creating a good space, not just in a training, but like in their organization and in their culture. Meanwhile, might still struggle to find their own voice. It's just dissonance, which I'm sure you know all about. So tell me, like, why does that happen? What's up?
Let me start with my own story because frankly, everyone says you write the book that you needed when you were younger. I would say I wrote the book that I still need. I grew up as the youngest daughter in an immigrant family from Taiwan. And so to respect my elders, respect the people around me means to stay silent. So that learned silence is deep in me. And I, frankly, having spent many years teaching other people's concepts, didn't think I had a voice of my own, didn't think I had anything of value to add of my own, and that my contributions and value add were simply because I was regurgitating or amplifying other people's thoughts. This process has taught me that I actually do have a voice. And by voice, I don't just mean the words that we say in a meeting, but by voice, I mean how we move through the world. So I'd actually encourage each of us to think about not just what do I want to say in the next meeting or what should I say in the next meeting, but what influence do I want to have? Because many of us got into this work because we care about personal growth, because we care about leadership development, because we care about effective teams, whatever that is, we each move through the world in a different way. So often when we're thinking about what should I say or what is a trainer supposed to do, we forget that our lived experiences, whatever they might be, actually offer value in and of themselves. So if you're wondering, what is my voice? How might I add value here? If you doubt whether you inherently have something to add, or if your only value is the role that you play, I'd actually challenge each of us to start with some internal work. And that internal work is invisible to the people around us. It is in that meeting. I guess we're calling him Jeremy. I don't know why we landed on that, but Jeremy is saying to you, this is what I need. Your learned silence and habit says, okay, but you're thinking that's not going to work. And here are the reasons why. Ask yourself in that moment, what do I think? What do I think reminds you that you have thoughts, reactions, feelings of your own that might be different than the dominant paradigms we're operating in? Over time, you can decide whether you want to share those thoughts. But if we think about influence and we think about value add, that's one way to remind ourselves we do actually have a voice that might look and sound different than what people are asking of us. To me, that is a good thing and a natural thing because we're all different. So why would we all think in the same way? Our ability to think, to see, and to offer a perspective allows us to course correct, allows us to iterate, allows us to push the conversation forward.
I'm going to jump back to the other question I was thinking, which may just segue into maybe a conversation about system stuff. I was thinking about how if you're new to an organization, or maybe you're younger, or maybe a million other reasons, that silence can be strategic, or it can seem strategic, or maybe you've been told outright. Yeah. Listen first, see how people do things. There's a reason why we do things. Like, how many times has someone been told that? I know I was told that more than once. And maybe you're like, again, this is just going back to your learned behavior. You're like, okay, well, that person is not saying anything, even though I feel like I can tell by their eye twitch that they didn't like that, but they're not saying anything. So I'm not saying anything. That seems to be a really big habit. It also made me think about sort of like generationally. There was a time where I've had this conversation with my mom before where she's like, that's okay if you think that, but don't talk about that with your manager. Because maybe that was a strategy that she definitely needed to use in her career that maybe that isn't applicable for me now in my career.
Totally. This is why chapter 3 of the book exists. Chapter 3 is when silence makes sense. Let me be the first to say and go on record saying unlearning silence does not mean saying everything all the time. The world is too noisy. The risks are too real at times. But the difference between silence that is additive or strategic versus oppressive and diminishing is agency. Are you choosing to stay silent in the moment for a distinct purpose that furthers one of your own goals? Or are you staying silent because that's the only way that you can keep your seat at the table, the only way that you can keep your job? And that agency, that internal locus of control matters. On the piece of silence being strategic, absolutely. And part of that is we are pushing against all of the gravitational forces within an organization. There are influence books that say you should make the people that you want to influence because we as human beings are wired to want to say yes to, are more likely to want to work with, and will like people who look and sound like us, period. And so as we're thinking about using our voices, particularly if we carry subordinated identities within an organization, whether those are visible or non-visible, we are pushing uphill. One of the examples in the book is medical resident biting his tongue against some things that the attending physician are doing that are frankly wrong and could be reported. And he's thinking, I'm going to bite my tongue because if I don't finish my residency, I don't have, my whole career is down the drain. So there is a short-term, long-term benefit analysis that we're all doing. The trick is to really interrogate for ourselves. Am I playing the long game or am I just giving myself a pass? The third place I would go vis-a-vis your mother, my mother, and generations is what world are we trying to create? Because we could perpetuate the norms and embody the advice given us. How well is that working for us personally? How well is that working in crafting the teams and workplaces we want to see? Many of those norms perpetuate the status quo, which works better for some than for others. Trained as a lawyer, I get really worried about sounding woo-woo. And I'd anchor to, we each have one life to live. So using your voice is, how do you want to live the life that you have? And also, how do you want to influence the sphere around you? Only you can do that short-term, long-term benefit analysis, preserving your own agency. In the book, I talk about a couple of biases that we need to watch out for. One is the present bias, right? In the short-term, long-term calculation, we tend to over-index on the short-term costs, like the immediate discomfort I have in pushing back against Jeremy, versus the long-term impact of what will happen if we do this training that flops. And then my whole department gets a bad rap. And sometimes people are like, training, eye roll, waste of time already. In what ways? If I do this thing that is suboptimal because I didn't push back in the moment or offer a different option, actually perpetuates the very thing I want to avoid. So catching some of our human pitfalls that we fall into in our own analysis to really think about what is the long-term impact I want to have, and then how do my choices today, tomorrow, and the next day play into that long-term impact.
I love it. I want to talk more about this action, taking action, finding our voice. So again, something you were saying made me think about switching up my question. You had talked a lot about little experiments and doing this self-interrogation, talking to yourself, which I want you to talk about. But also it made me think, maybe some people do want to go out guns blazing and just start firing off, saying whatever they want. And maybe because they haven't for a while, it made me start to wonder, like, if you've just been so pent up energy, pent up thoughts for silencing yourself for so long. Is that a thing? Do people do that? And
people do that often after menopause. I've seen it happen. And there's no good or bad about it. Each of our voices is going to sound different. And that has been a fundamental learning for me. One of my first jobs was actually teaching piano to young kids. And there was this one student who just would not listen. I observed their family dynamic, and their grandmother would just yell and shout orders at her. And I was like, well, maybe that's how they communicate around here. Let me try that. And so I tried my best to yell at her. And it was just the most laughable moment that had no effect, because that's not my voice. That's now how I show up in the world. And so if you're trying to do a good impression of someone else, it can be a good or even great impression, but it's not going to be as powerful as your authentic voice. And there's a whole post-it note conversation we could have about authenticity and the privilege of being authentic and who gets to be authentic. But that moment to me said, oh, wait, we actually do need to influence in our own way rather than try to do what other people might expect of us or what we see happen in the systems.
I was thinking about your method of taking action, and you encourage experiments, but then also coupled it with, what if it's not little experiments and questions to yourself? You're just sort of going all in 150%, starting now and always.
And I think that's totally fine, right? I offer the idea of small experiments, and my guidance around small experiments are make them time bound and make them low risk to try to get data points under your belt of, oh, I can actually use my voice and there is positive impact. Those of us who have learned silence and hesitate to speak up, a lot of that is because we don't have the life experiences that say to us, hey, I spoke up and it made a difference, versus people who have those life experiences tend to be less hesitant to speak up. They don't stop and think about, why couldn't I say it? Of course you can say that. If you're at a point, you're a boiling point and it all comes out, there's nothing wrong to me about that, particularly if you're also at a point in life where you can stomach any of the potential blowback. Now, one of the pitfalls we talked about was that we over-index and often think that the blowback is going to be worse than it actually is. The blowback or the repercussions differ based on the identities we carry. So race, gender, ethnicity, ability, education, class, etc. But if you have enough privilege, and by privilege, I mean the ability to stomach the backlash, I think we need more people being loud. Some people might say guns a-blazing. That has lots of different implications there. But however your voice comes out, to me, at least, we've then surfaced things and we can work with the substance. It's like in a training when a participant has been silent and then they finally come out and say, like, this is such a waste of time. To me, that's actually a really beautiful moment. And this is part of speaking up that I talk about, of embrace resistance. Salespeople use this technique all the time. My saying no or replying to your cold email is actually a win because it's engagement of some sort. And you saying this training is a waste of time, tell me about what doesn't work about this. What would make it a good use of your time? You are actually having a conversation that to me is more useful than complete silence in the room where we can't read you. Is this landing? Are you planning your dinner? Are you making weekend plans right now? Are you thinking about Q4? Versus having that conversation that allows us then to connect in an effective way and land the outcomes and plant the seeds for behavior change that we're looking for. Resistance to me is gold because it is the source of the information going forward. So is there a perfect way to use your voice? No. I think anyone who says this is exactly the way that you're supposed to speak up, these are the words you should use, I would be really hesitant about taking that advice because I don't think it works for everybody. I think the advice, practical words, prompts, they can be useful jumping off points. And fundamentally, you need to figure out what works for you. And you can do that through experimentation or explosion.
I love it. I like that recommendation. There's no one way to communicate or use your voice. Because I had a question in the mitigated speech section. You were talking about examples of speech, and there's different levels of directness and things like commands versus suggestions or questions or hints, which are going to be less direct. And this got me thinking back to facilitation. That can often be a purposeful strategy as a facilitator where you suggest ideas. And I'm curious, how do levels of directness affect a trainer's language and their strategy for facilitating groups?
To me, the bottom line about levels of directness is to have the ability for range, because the context in which we operate and the people that we meet when we're training are all going to be different. Having the ability to flex from being really direct or in a low context culture hint, right? Can you match your level of directness to the purpose in the moment? And do you have the ability to flex across ranges of directness. And we'll say one of my early facilitation experiences was with a division of the Marines. I identify and appear as female. I identify and appear as Asian. I don't have a whole lot of credibility when I walk in the room. And it wasn't until I was really direct and dropped an F-bomb that they were like, oh, I guess we can listen to her. Which is not the same approach I would use in an educational context, particularly K through 12. Can you match your level of directness to the context, to the purpose, so that you are meeting the people where they're at? And that to me is the skill set of, am I aware of the drawbacks of mitigated speech? And the examples in the book are around a conversation I had with my brother where he doesn't know what I'm thinking because I haven't actually said it. And that fundamental frustration that I've seen with so many clients, so many trainers of, wait, why don't you get it? Oh, it's because I haven't actually said it. I know in my head what I'm telling you to do, but you don't know. It also gets us to one of my pet peeves with coaching is this question-led elicitive approach that so many people have been taught to do because that's the right way to coach. You're supposed to lead the horse to water rather than give them water, I think is the analogy. The coachee, the recipient, the direct report is sitting there thinking like, I can't read your mind. If you already have an answer, why don't you just tell me, which is make a proposal, and then we can react. A proposal is not a command. It is not a directive, but at least we all know what we're talking about rather than dancing around the subject and missing each other and getting increasingly frustrated. So for us as a community of trainers, I would really be encouraging us to develop that range of directness. And then the craft and the art is knowing which level of directness in what context is going to best serve your purpose.
I like that you tied it back to coaching. I've heard it referred to as like inquiry versus advocacy, and that there should be a balance. I think it goes to your example where there's going to be different contexts and reasons why you should have different levels of directness and meeting people where they're at or what makes sense in the moment or for the purpose. And the same thing could apply for when you're going to tell someone what to do in a coaching setting, maybe as a manager. Or another, again, good segue for me to another question. You have this 3 buckets technique used in coaching, but I think also applies to like meetings or just like anything in general. I also love that you call it buckets because I like to use that terminology a lot when I'm trying to hash up a quick framework. So just the name of it, I really enjoyed. I would love for you to describe this technique.
The 3 buckets are in every decision, every topic we're wrestling with, every project we're working on, every plan that we're making. There are 3 different roles. One is who gets to decide. The second is who's consulted. And the third is who is informed. And there's a bunch of different iterations. I have no claim that this is the best one. It's just the one that I find easiest. You could also do an iteration of RACI and all of its derivatives, right? There are fancy spreadsheets on Google around that for project planning. But the reason it's relevant when it comes to voice and silence is because one of the friction points I've observed across industry, across geography, is people think that they are a decision maker. Then they get offended and frustrated and think they aren't heard when they aren't. They realize, oh, wait, Jeremy's going to make the call anyways. Or they think they were consulted, or managers say, tell me what you think. Because managers often think, I need to be inclusive. I need to consult my team. I'm supposed to hear different perspectives, but they already know what they're going to do. And so people get really frustrated and it undercuts trust and credibility because it's, you know what, if Jeremy, you already knew what you're going to do, why did you waste my time to ask me what I think? And so the buckets are a way to sort responsibilities and get clarity and alignment to avoid that pain point, avoid that misunderstanding that leads so many people to say, you know what, if you don't care about my opinion, I just won't offer it next time. So the role, if you're being consulted, is to advocate for what you think is the best idea, to offer your insights, but to also remember that you're not the end decision maker. And if we're doing this in a healthy environment, the roles change between decision maker, consult, and inform, right? A CEO should not be consulted, I'd argue, on what snacks are going to be present at the training. That is not a good, effective use of time and energy. That decision should be held by someone else. Another reality is that the world and our teams cannot run on consensus. You can't consult everybody. This my door's always open invitation to say what you think is really misleading, because the reality is we may be in a decision-making process or a part of the project where actually input is no longer necessary or welcome. The ship has sailed on that. More important is the clarity on who is in which bucket, and do we all agree as to who is in what bucket. The area of negotiation is if you think you should be a joint decision maker, or you think you should be consulted, but someone else has put you in the inform bucket. But how do you even know that that's happening other than to have explicit conversations and dialogue about which bucket rather than finding out after the fact?
You said a healthy culture, ideally you would rotate. So sometimes you're just being informed, sometimes you're consulting, sometimes you get to be the decision maker. I could see it being deflating if you're always in the inform bucket and you're never consulted and you never have any decision making. Then you're like, why should I ever use my voice?
Totally. And let me do the analysis for the leader too. If you are always the decision maker, not only are you going to be dealing with decision fatigue, but you cannot scale. You have to let go. If you cannot trust the people on your team to make sound decisions, then I would be asking the question of whether you have the right team, and also digging into why you don't trust them. But holding on to all of the decisions serves no one.
Maybe that brings us back to when we were chatting before we hit record, just again about systems. I mentioned to you, I was listening to Adam Grant's recent podcast. I hope I don't say her name wrong. I think it's Sarah Edmondson. She was part of this cult, Nexium. And of course, this made me think of you. She said that she ended up being one of the main whistleblowers and first whistleblowers to expose what was happening inside this organization. And she thought that maybe the reason why was because she was physically removed from the rest of the organization. They were in one city. She was actually in another city. So still wrapped up in a lot of it, but maybe that ultimately helped her pull away from the control or whatever it was. So I didn't even know how to frame this question. It made me think about having a voice, how she was able to use it, maybe why some other people were not. And I would love for you to share again how you think about this.
It is really hard to accurately diagnose a situation when you're in it. This is the value of consultants. This is the value of outside perspective. And we could go back to Albert Hirschman's work around voice, exit, or loyalty. In a system, if you use your voice and you're not heard, then the two choices that you're left with are either exit or loyalty, right? Leave or stay loyal. And over time, the more loyal you are and the more you are rewarded for being loyal, the less you can see the outside perspective. One of the reasons I wanted to write Unlearning Silence was because as I looked around at the diagnosis of this collective situation we're in, the advice around speaking up and using your voice essentially boils down to a Nike, just do it, right? Be more direct, have more courage, have more confidence. The problem is you. If you could fix it, then your training would be a success. If you could fix yourself. And frankly, I think we're asking the wrong question there. The question I think we should be asking is, what role does silence play on our teams? What role does silence play in my life? And in what ways is silence baked into our systems, our practices, and our processes? And if we can name that accurately, then we have levers for looking at how to change it in a sustainable way, in a way that honors people's dignity and expertise and gets us to the collaboration and innovation that so many of us are looking for. It's really hard to see it from inside the system. And so that's the benefit of Sarah and others getting a little bit outside where you can actually see it. I see this in each of our own personal careers as well. People who have taken sabbaticals. I'm a huge proponent of sabbaticals. You cannot see the pattern that you're in and that you're living as clearly as if you step slightly out of the regular pattern and rhythm. You can get some of that insight by hiring a coach because they're looking at you and the dynamic from the outside. But how can we shift our perspective? One way for me of shifting our perspective is to look through the lens of silence I don't have all the answers of what we need to do, but I do know the levers, which is what is my own learned silence? In what ways do I silence the people around me? And in what ways is silence baked into the systems? And if we look and interrogate at those three levels, we have a far more accurate diagnosis of what's going on and a way forward.
It triggered another question that I forgot to ask you about. You use this phrase of using process to support your voice. And it almost struck a chord that you're replacing some of the habits and processes or systems that may be broken that you have now with new ones, or incorporating processes where they don't exist. See, I'm just loading up a bunch of questions I have about all of this. What if you're a fly by the seat of your pants kind of person? Is adding all these processes going to mess up your flow and your voice? Maybe that's just privilege. I don't know.
No, I love that, because to me, process can get a bad rap. Process can feel rigorous, right? Particularly in certain industries. I've worked in oil and gas, and it's like, well, someone's going to fall off the rig if you don't have process, and it is almost become a joke. To me, process is just the how of how we work. So if you're a fly by the seat of your pants person, that inherently is a process. That inherently could work well for you. One of the questions is how that process that you have intersects with that process, the how or the habits of how other people work, and the how and the habits that make it easiest for them to use their voice. Because the dynamic that happens is if we're not actively discussing or designing process, we default to the habits and the how of the people with the most power in an organizational system. Which is why we tend to have meetings at prime time for the CEO, even if it is 4 a.m. in someone else's time zone or 11:30 p.m. in someone else's time zone. It's not to say that that's not the right outcome, but can we be intellectually honest about the impact of that decision, which is to incline the person who's in the 4 a.m. or 11:30 p.m. time zone, if that's not their prime time, towards silence? Because there's an inherent barrier that they have to overcome in order to share their thoughts and use their voice. There's no perfect time zone. I've tried to find it in our global working context, but can we optimize for voice? Another, in terms of wiring, and this gets back to facilitation and workshops, is how do people process information? Are you a verbal processor? Which so many of us as a facilitator want people to be verbal processors because I get information. I actually see engagement. But if you're a post processor, what I really need to give you is time. Mm-hmm. And it's okay if you're silent. It's okay if you're taking notes and not verbalizing questions. It's not as emotionally satisfying for me in the moment, but it shouldn't be about me. So can I design the how of how we communicate, how we work, how we facilitate to optimize for different learning styles, for different working styles, for different wiring? Because what we tend to do, particularly in corporate spaces, is prioritize the people whose wiring leads them to communicate most effectively in 3 succinct bullet points in real time. That inherently silences people with different wiring. And in fact, we say it's a weakness. We don't attach it to wiring. We say it's weak and you need to fix it. And therefore, then you could have some executive presence and we might be able to promote you. Mm-hmm. But to me, process is just the how, and there's always a how. But if we're not aware of what the how is, it defaults to the people with the most institutional, organizational, and hierarchical power.
I know you have lots of reflection questions at the end of each chapter. You have a roadmap. There's so much of your book that we didn't get to, so I'm just letting folks know, but we're running out of time. So I hope folks are interested and engaged and post-processing or recurrent processing, verbal processing as they listen, and are excited to learn more. I want to switch gears though for a moment and go back to you as we wrap up. Can you tell us a little bit about how you are learning, growing, getting out of your comfort zone this year?
Oh, I am launching a book. I think I started by saying I'm an accidental author. I never intended to write a book. I have never written something so involved. And I would argue that raising a young child, I have a 6-year-old, is not the life stage to take that on. And the writing of the book actually now feels easy in comparison to the promotion and the marketing of the book. I just filmed an unboxing video that is deeply uncomfortable for me. the growth edge, the learning for me is to recognize that even though I have more than a decade of experience facilitating, teaching, educating, filming an unboxing video to make an Instagram reel is a new skill set for me. I am growing in that way. And so that is deeply uncomfortable, and let it be deeply uncomfortable. And good thing is none of us do life alone. So there are other people who know plenty about Instagram Reels who can advise me and help me bring that to life. But so much of this new adventure as an author in owning my own content, in putting a book into the world, is all new skill sets. And I am doing it because I think it's worthwhile. I'm doing it because I hope the content in the book helps well-intentioned leaders actually show up with that good impact. I hope it helps people who have long been silenced feel seen, known, and heard. And for all of us to more accurately diagnose the situation we're in so we can get to a more effective solution together.
Beautiful. And where can folks find you or keep up with any activity if they want to keep learning from you?
You can see awkward Instagram Reels on Instagram. I am most active on LinkedIn, Elaine Lin Hering, and I have a monthly newsletter linked in my bio in both places that offers tips and strategies for using your voice.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Elaine. This has been such a pleasure, such a treat to be able to talk to you in person. And congratulations again on your book.
Thank you. Take good care.
Thank you to our sponsor, Tier 1 Performance.
Thanks for listening to this podcast from the Association for Talent Development. Be sure to check the show notes for resources mentioned in today's episode. And if you found the show useful or insightful, please be sure to like, subscribe, and share it with a colleague.